thank you to CFA UK and to your CEO, Will Goodhart, for the invitation to present our report today. And I'm also looking forward to the debate with our panellists afterwards. I'm going to present the key areas of the report, and then Mark will present the 10 key recommendations which make up our call to action at the end. So in January last year, I was commissioned to write and research a report on the ethical dimensions of diversity by the Institute of Business Ethics. Little did I know what lay ahead in 2020, and that it would bring an urgency to the diversity agenda that I could never have envisaged. Having been involved in diversity advocacy since 2011, the pace of change in the past year or so, and the evolving expectations on companies, their investors, and society more generally has been unparalleled. The urgency for this change has been fueled by the pandemic and racial injustices that have amplified existing systemic inequalities, which were already being exposed through movements such as Me Too prior to the pandemic. And in addition, the increasing recognition of the importance of environmental, social, and governance considerations have reinforced the view that the social license to operate of companies is critical to long-term value, and the pandemic is testing that social license to its core. The need to consider stakeholders beyond shareholders should now be self-evident to companies and their boards. And diversity is critical to this. Visibility of diverse leaders, the importance of diverse role models, and diverse representation are all important for stakeholder relations. This manifests itself acutely at board level, where the board is taken as the outward face of the organisation. And all of this coincides with the expectation of more assertive and transparent investment stewardship activities from all types of investors. So the report seeks to provide boards with a framework for understanding the ethical dimensions to diversity and to addressing them systematically. It stands at a point in time, in December 2020, to reflect on what has been achieved, the lessons learned, and the challenges ahead. And it offers guidance on how boards can get ahead of the curve on all dimensions of diversity to achieve more inclusive corporate cultures. The report starts with an exploration of the importance of diversity and the challenge of groupthink. We examine why diverse teams make better decisions. The work of Professor Scott Page, an American social scientist, evidences a diversity bonus, where diverse groups almost always outperform homogenous groups. And the risk of groupthink is explored through the work of Irvin Janis, and we consider how this impacts board decision-making. And we consider that boards that are not diverse are subject to an added layer of governance risk related to homogeneity and groupthink. The changing collective skill set of the board is examined amidst calls for more health professionals on boards in response to the pandemic, and the need to ensure the management of other systemic risks, such as climate change. And all of this should be factored into board succession plans as boards face a new and much more challenging landscape. Chapter 2 reflects on the 10 years of efforts to improve gender diversity in the UK, including why we started with gender, and the key developments such as a UK government-backed Davies Review in 2010, the Hampton-Alexander Review from 2016 onwards, and legislation such as the gender pay gap. We examine other important levers of change, such as the advocacy work of the 30% Club and its investor group, which was set up in 2011, as well as requirements on diversity from the UK Corporate Governance Code. We look at what has been achieved in terms of meeting targets set by Hampton-Alexander and the 30% Club, and stress that meeting the targets represent minimum thresholds, not the end goal. And we identify some gaps, which I will talk about in more detail later. Chapter 3 looks at whether the focus on gender diversity has delivered on its full potential. We explore the traditional business case for diversity, framed around corporate performance, and examine evidence from McKinsey, Credit Suisse, and others, including academic evidence, and we explore the challenges of causation and correlation. We also look at the unethical dimensions to the business case. Why do we actually need to prove corporate outperformance when adding women or members of other underrepresented groups to board and leadership teams? From the work of the late Professor Catherine Phillips, a business theorist, it is clear that linking improved diversity to enhancing the bottom line has unethical dimensions to it, because it reinforces the idea that some people belong and others have to prove that they do. We explore other ways in which we can understand the impact of increased gender diversity at board level, including through improved board governance, risk oversight, and in the sustainability profile of the company. We examine the concept of substantive gender diversity developed by Professor Yaron Nilly, who argues that it is not just about having more female directors on boards, but it is about the roles they take and the clout they have. We consider why female directors tend to be in certain leadership roles, but not in others. According to BoardX, there is now a majority of female remuneration committee chairs in FTSE 350 boards. But women don't seem to be appearing in board chair roles, other committee chair roles, or in CEO roles to nearly the same extent. And Sir Philip Hampton, chair of the Hampton-Alexander Review, referred to this as a structural subordination of the female role. We look at gender differences in leadership traits. Understanding these switches the narrative to what women bring to organisations rather than what men have to give up. So whilst the business case for diversity remains strong and is now widely accepted, the key conclusion is that there is still much to be done in delivering on the full potential of gender diversity. The report argues that improvement has not been seen consistently because a compliance mindset in simply meeting diversity targets is not enough. And this will need to be addressed given the same target-driven approach is being adopted to increase racial and ethnic diversity at board level. So Chapter 4 argues that inclusion requires a genuine commitment to change. And to achieve cognitive diversity, there needs to be a move beyond meeting targets to a focus on the qualitative aspects and addressing imbalances in identity diversity, be that gender, race, ethnicity, disability, neurodiversity, or sexuality, by bringing a diversity of lived experiences. Diversity has to permeate at a strategic level and then cross the entire operations of the board, the executive committee, and the company as a whole. A good first step would be reporting on how diversity links to strategy, a key requirement of the UK Corporate Governance Code. We explore the role of investors in driving change. This involves actors across the investment chain, from large fund managers to pension funds and activist shareholders, and efforts that are both collective as well as unilateral. And from the extensive company engagement I've undertaken during my time within institutional investment, including leading collaborative efforts with the 30% Club Investor Group, I believe the role of investors and the collective investor voice has the power to be transformational in driving change. I've been involved in diversity advocacy since 2011, when Railpen became an inaugural member of the 30% Club's UK Investor Group. And since then, the group has grown from 7 members with 1.6 trillion in assets under management to 39 members with 11 trillion in collective assets. And there are now parallel investor groups in Brazil, France, Australia, Canada, and Japan. One of the most effective features of the investor group is its statement of intent, which is a public commitment by the members to signal their collective voice to companies and the wider marketplace about the importance of diversity and how investors will use their ownership rights and stewardship work to drive progress. And since 2011, it has been really interesting to observe the increasing number of investors stating that diversity is now a key priority for their stewardship activities. And I predict that this will only continue, especially as the 2020 Stewardship Code here in the UK encourages investors to engage on diversity, to address market-wide and systemic risks, and to engage through investor collaborations and other escalation strategies. So the report also looks at diversity funds, including in equity and in social bonds, which are also focusing demand. And we also look at the vital role that executive search firms have in driving diversity. And as I said, we end with our call to action, including 10 key recommendations for boards. Before I hand over to Mark to take us through these, I just wanted to focus quickly on what we've achieved in the UK and some of the gaps. So could we have the next slide, please? So in terms of achievements, well, we've met the targets on board gender diversity in terms of board representation, and we now have no all-male boards in the FTSE 350. And we've used a voluntary multi-stakeholder approach without legislative quotas. And one of the levers of change through the stakeholder approach has been investor power, which I think is now being utilised, although not quite to its fullest extent. But we've got many gaps, including the high number of all-male executive committees that still exist, 98 as of the 1st of April this year, and a recognition that there is an insufficient people of colour on boards and in executive leadership positions, and that executive leadership gap also applies to women. We also need to focus on all companies, including private companies and smaller companies. But as I said, the key risk identified is this compliance mindset in meeting targets. And the report seeks to help boards to avoid such an approach. And so I'll now hand over to Mark, who will talk us through our 10 key recommendations to boards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And if we could have the next slide, that would be great. Well, we commissioned this report not just to highlight a concern about the mindset, progress of change and some of the challenges ahead, but to try to put forward some practical recommendations for what boards could do to move beyond targets and to embrace, blend and leverage very different life experiences and ways of thinking around the table. So we put forward 10 recommendations to start the debate. First, we recommend that boards do more structured reflection on the differences of thought and experience around the table. We encourage greater use of scenario exercises, particularly those with an ethical dimension, where there isn't an objectively right answer and where personal value judgments will come into play. So an exercise on how to respond to a ransomware demand will be more likely to stretch the team and expose groupthink than one on data theft. We encourage organizations to see diversity and inclusion as a competitive advantage and to showcase in their 172 reporting how diverse thinking has improved board decision-making. We encourage boards to look critically at the culture in the boardroom to ensure that there's a culture of debate and not one of endorsement. And we show how some simple disciplines can bring alternative approaches and a broader range of stakeholder views into the boardroom. We think that a bold reappraisal of board nomination and succession processes is critical if you really want to surface potential candidates beyond the usual suspects. Setting overly narrow criteria, which major on board and industry experience, unnecessarily restricts the field of potential candidates. Processes also need to be far more fair, open and transparent. Boards need to accept that this means that getting there will take longer and be more challenging. Nomination committees also need to look at the roles assigned to individual board members to ensure that you don't reinforce group thinking by stereotyping and defaulting an ex-HR leader or lawyer to the REMCO or an ex-CFO to the audit committee. This should be about finding the right blend of complementary experiences at a board and a committee level. If I could have the next slide, please. So we offer in the report some learnings from the 10-year effort to improve gender representation on boards. The same just-in-time approaches to addressing the other dimensions of diversity simply won't work, particularly given the accelerated pace of change being demanded from all sides and all directions. we recommend engaging with external groups like Open for Business and the Valuable 500 to help you through some of the more difficult discussions that will be needed. And we emphasize that boards should be actively listening to an even wider range of stakeholders. You referred at the beginning to Aaron, to Inga Beale's comment about the need for the conversations to be happening in the boardroom. I think there's a greater need for listening. We emphasize that diversity and inclusion can't just be a bolt-on. Aims and milestones need to be not just communicated internally and externally, but they need to be fully integrated into recruitment, reward, and talent management processes. And because this has to start with the board, an honest appraisal of the board's own effectiveness at the top team is needed. I think there's a vital need to raise the bar on board effectiveness reviews. Those doing these are sometimes distinctly conflicted from rocking the boat. The outcomes rarely include an action plan to deliver on the outcomes recommended, and boards are hardly incentivized to be candid and self-critical in their reporting. And finally, boards need to recognize how the inequalities that they're tackling reflect systemic issues in society. These issues are difficult, but they're immensely important in achieving a just and fair society. There's a rapidly growing expectation that businesses should take a lead on those issues, and certainly a wide expectation from the workforce that they should be able to talk about these issues at work, and that senior leadership, including the board, should be listening. So the next slide, please. So why is this so hard? Well, being represented in the room is not the same as being valued and listened to. Representation is not enough. And without a genuine commitment to inclusion, you can end up defaulting to compliance and tokenism. These are hard issues about power, identity, and justice. They're awkward conversations to start, laced with concerns about terminology and a genuine fear of causing offense. But simply not engaging is no longer a credible option. An authentic commitment to strive for inclusion in the boardroom and throughout the business, establishing an atmosphere where everyone can be their true selves and have an equal opportunity to contribute, has to come from the top, and it has to be led by the chair. And if as a chair you do make that commitment, you're in for longer, more difficult meetings, more challenge, and far more open and protracted recruitment processes. There's no obvious short-term reward for authenticity. Next slide, please. But for those who do commit, the board will be more effective. It will make better, more robust, values-based decisions, and it will have the opportunity to differentiate through reporting at a time when there are enormous pressures to divide companies into good and bad. It's vital to remember that businesses don't operate in isolation from the issues in society, and that they're increasingly expected to take a lead on those issues. In an open fight for talent and an environment where unlocking discretionary effort is key, the top team are more visible than ever and need to lead by example. And boards should want to do this. This is so clearly the right thing to do, and it makes good business sense.
Great. Mark, Deborah, thank you so much for sharing your important work and for such an interesting presentation. I am now delighted to introduce our esteemed panel of speakers. If you have any questions for the panel, as Aaron called out earlier, please do paste them into the Q&A box and we'll cover them later in the Q&A portion of this session. So first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Ruth Carne, who is chair at Babcock International Group. Ruth is also a senior independent director at Associated British Foods and chairs the Remuneration Committee. Ruth has previously served on the boards of Rolls-Royce Holdings, Keller Group and Contour Global. Ruth is the industry chair of Powerful Women and the patron of the Women in Defence Charter. She is a trustee of Windsor Leadership and is also a supporting chair of Chapter Zero and a member of the COVID Recovery Commission. Ruth was formerly Executive Vice President, Strategy and Planning at Royal Dutch Shell, where she held a number of senior international roles, including managing the global commercial fuels business. Welcome to the panel, Ruth. Next, it is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Chao to the panel. Christine is Global Head of Strategic Governance and ESG Integration at IHS Markit. Christine has 24 years experience in investment management, research and consulting with a focus on ESG, technology and sustainability. Before joining IHS Markit, Christine was a director at Federated Hermes as the global lead of technology and head of Asia and global emerging market stewardship, as well as chair of the SDG Fixed Income Committee. Her PhD thesis on responsible investment was shortlisted for a United Nations Award in Sweden for industry relevance and academic excellence. She is a member of Court and Investment Committee of the London School of Economics and a board member of the International Corporate Governance Network. In addition, Christine was named as one of the top 30 inspirational women in the City of London. And last year in 2020, she won the Finance Monthly Women in Finance Award as the Investment Management of the Year for Asia. Great to have you here, Christine. And finally, I am delighted to introduce Raj Tulsiani. Raj is the CEO and co-founder of the award-winning consultancy Green Park and has become one of the UK's leading figures in executive search, interim management, workforce planning and diversification. He has over 20 years experience moving the dial on leadership, talent and diversity, and is the author of Diversity and Inclusion for Leaders, Making a Difference with the Diversity Headhunter. As the leader of one of the recruitment industry's few minority-owned businesses, Raj is a passionate advocate of the power of diversity as a source of competitive advantage, leading a team that sets the benchmark for innovation and commitment to consistently attracting and retaining diverse groups of appointable leadership candidates. Welcome to the panel, Raj. And hi, and thank you, panel. We really appreciate your time with us today. Okay, Aaron, I'll hand over to you for our first question.
Thanks very much, Michael. So kicking off, we hear a lot of headlines, and I think we just want to talk more about what actually constitutes a diverse board. So I just want to share some headlines from that were in the FT last week, based on the Hydrogen Struggles survey on UK board activity. And the headlines read as follows. Women made up more than half of the new FTSE 350 boardroom directors last year, as companies came under pressure to improve the gender balance of their top management. Another headline read, more than 4/5 of new roles were taken by white people, with the majority of the remainder coming from Asian backgrounds, with just 3% of new Black directors. So I'd just like to ask the panel, looking beyond the headlines and given the compelling need for very cognitive and experiential diversity on a board, I'd like to ask them how they would define or what constitutes a diverse board for you. And perhaps we can start with Christine and potentially followed by Raj. Thanks.
Thank you, CFA, for your very kind invitation to this very important topic, and it's also rapidly developing in its diversity and coverage and its meaning as well, diversity and inclusion. When I saw that, when you sent me the FT article, quote, I thought that's very interesting. We are mixing white people and people's color skin with their backgrounds, the geographical background. And if we take a look at it, this is how most people tend to categorize individuals into different buckets as well. Whether it is right to compare people's skin color with the regional association, maybe we can leave it for another time. But it is often the case that we see diversity as something very visible to what we can see. So, for example, I remember that one of the Southeast Asian market that I had to visit on a business trip, on their form, their visa form, they actually asked, what is my skin color? And I wrote down yellow, because actually, according to the 18th century anthropology, East Asian, ethnically, the skin is supposed to be yellow. And then I remember my colleague was saying that, Christine, they're going to think that you have jaundice. I said, no, don't worry. So just going back to diversity, coming back to what makes a diverse board. I think initially what we really want to know is that what is the hardware we have? What we can see is the gender that is different. That bit of diversity we can see, and in fact we're looking at also maybe specific categorization of independence. And that's why we ask for board skills matrix. We want the diversity that we can see and we can put down on paper. But what is really important is how does it actually work? So it actually links to the paper from Mark and Deborah very well, is the inclusion part, that you've shifted the conversation from the importance of diversity. But what we really want is the inclusion. How does it work in practice? Which means that we look at the board culture and dynamics, and it can only really be assessed through conversations, through engagement, whether it is with investor or through other types of engagement, is understanding and posting challenging questions to the board and see how different directors respond. Are they open to different ideas? How do they manage their different perspectives? And that is the real value of diversity, is the inclusion in practice, but we start off with the diversity. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. And a lot of those points you've mentioned do resonate, definitely, with respect to professional experiences we've all had. Raj, would you like to share some additional thoughts?
Sure. So, I mean, I think this is one of the areas where we've got a lot of analog thinking in a digital world, a lot of old-fashioned ways of looking at things. If you start off with the very basic principles, board diversity is the combination of inherited and acquired diversity characteristics present in your board members, and arguably their succession plans and external advisors. If you want to look at a wider interpretation based on the needs of governance for an organisation to better question what makes them effective, then you get into this as a sign of competence. So how you're measuring the board's competence by their ability to deliver promises and commitments in this area. The basic problem you've got is threefold. It's an existing and comfortable narrative to allow the current groupthink to maintain control. So you get agendas around board governance and stewardship, which consciously or subconsciously refer back to people like us. And that is mentioned often not by protected characteristic, but by level of affinity and level of risk attached to a new hire. So that's the case because we're operating from a fixed position. So although the need for governance and skills on the board has changed, particularly post-pandemic, the way we attach value to those skills is still largely based on fiduciary and legal responsibilities. Hence the idea of analog thinking for a digital world. So you get, how does that manifest itself? Well, you get the first thing, which is always, the talent is out there. The talent is not out there. So I know by putting 200 or overseeing 200 board placements in the last 25 months that the talent is out there, because 35% of those are ethnic minorities, 58% of them women. The reality is those candidates are overbroked and now don't look at the FTSE 100 as a fantastic destination part of their portfolio. They see risk, they see challenge around delivering change, which now, with every organisation working in the glass box, creates some personal risk for them. The second thing you say and you see is, but it's all about the best person for the job. But what makes that person the best person for a job comes into the point that was made in the report about the changing nature of board governance and how you create a structure that's relevant for tomorrow, not yesterday. And whether it's diversity, managing through a pandemic, the race to net zero, tackling the brand dangers around a particular behavioural incident, these are all kind of agility points and skills that don't happen if you've been sitting on the board of BP for the last 15 years. Just as one of the panelists mentioned in the pre-conversation about ransomware. This is a new world we're in. We shouldn't be measuring the appropriateness for boards in the way that we did 5 or 10 years ago. But fundamentally, the problem I see and the problem I think the report really needs to answer is that people just don't know what to do. We're consulting for 5 of the 7 biggest retailers in the country that actually have shops at the moment today. And even in those firms, the way they define the problem, the relationship between diversity, inclusion, equity, that whole debate has not yet permeated into day-to-day operational changes in strategy and behaviours and compensation and hiring, etc. So we get a great narrative about how things are changing, but for the organisations bulk of their employees. And for their customers, when you're talking about service levels or appropriateness of service, nothing's changed. So this is a real danger with this constant conversation about D&I when nothing's changed. We're trying to boil the ocean. And the reality, unfortunately, and I'll finish in a minute, is that most people in this area will have seen the headline from our business report a few months ago that said, no, for the first time in 6 years, no black CEOs, CFOs or chairs in the FTSE 100. We map those 10,000 jobs every year. It's the first time in 6 years. But where the problem to that goes to is the D&I departments. And if you look at leadership of D&I departments, you see less diversity than in most other departments. So, forget about the cobbler's children. We're giving the question to the people who can't do it for their own departments. And what that effectively means is that there is a response that supports the existing executive groupthink. And if there isn't the governance from the board to measure that change and to hold people accountable, then we get stuck in this rut where amplifying our aspirations seems to be enough. Well, most customers don't think it's enough anymore.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for sharing that. And it kind of brings to mind a Bloomberg Green analysis that was done, I think, middle of last year, where they looked at European and US banks and found, while we're in the midst of the climate crisis, the preponderance of expertise was actually, in terms of board members, were their backgrounds in oil and gas. And just a complete dearth of expertise with respect to climate solutions, climate strategies. So the in-house expertise is really key, as you've mentioned. With that, I'll hand over to Michael to ask the second question. Thanks. Oh, Ruth,
Sorry, Ruth.
Please feel free to add.
Could I come in and just sort of add a couple of thoughts on that? Because I thought that really very much agree with what both Christine and Raj have said there. And Raj, what you were talking about, things just not changing. So with my role with Powerful Women, which is focused on more diversity, more senior women in the energy sector, one of the things we talk about a lot is the fact that the whole energy sector has to undergo this complete transition where we need completely different business models, relationships, partnerships, engagement with consumers, and so on and so on. And if we can't really bring in proper, really bring in new and different people and then enable them to contribute effectively, if we keep having the same sort of people in the same group think driving things, we just haven't got a hope of getting the energy transition underway. So that resonated very much. I just wanted though to flag one thing. I really like the way the report has flagged up that we need to take our thinking really forward to the next big step on what diversity means. But on the other hand, to my mind, visible diversity is still really important because it is there as a sort of visible symbol of diversity. It's there for role models. And so I see it very much, I think you said this, Deborah, as necessary but not sufficient. And it's sort of taking the big shift into all the other aspects as well that we need to be really looking at. But I do remember, 20 years ago when I first saw the big focus on gender diversity, that there was a big tendency for people in powerful positions to immediately pivot from something like gender diversity to, oh, well, we need all kinds of diversity, because that was a good way of avoiding actually having to do anything. And so I think it's important that we really get to grips with what we mean by this and then how to hold ourselves and others to account.
Indeed. No, thanks very much, Ruth, for sharing that. Michael?
Thank you. Our second question focuses on greater diversity amongst key board and leadership roles within companies. So in the 5th and final year of the Hampton-Alexander Review, published in March 2021, which for those in the audience who may not be familiar, this is a multi-stakeholder initiative supported by the UK government to increase the representation of women in senior leadership positions on the boards of FTSE companies. The following results were shared. So of the FTSE 250 functional leadership roles, women had the following representations: Human Resources Director, 65%, General Counsel, 42%, Finance Director, 16%, and Chief Information Officer, 9%. And so the question we'd like to ask the panel, how can we ensure that board diversity is not simply about tokenism or simply a box ticking exercise, moving away from the mentality of one and done and really moving towards a paradigm of company value creation? Ruth, can I invite you to answer that one first?
Yeah, I'm sure, Michael. So first of all, just thinking, so I'll focus here on gender diversity, because I think you've sort of referred to the Hampton-Alexander review, and that was very much the focus there. And I think I'd start by saying that, actually, the fact that we've now got to 33% of board positions being held by women, and looking at the executive pipeline, the top sort of 2 levels in companies, that we've got to 33% of those roles being women, that is much, much better than where we were. So that is real progress. And it does mean that we've got more female voices at the top of organizations, which is a very good thing. But this sort of one and done, and the sense of it being box ticking. So the one and done mindset was very prevalent, I think, in the early days of the Davis Review. So going back 10 years, when, the boards, felt they had to do something, but it was going to be awfully difficult and they wouldn't be able to find the right women. And then they reluctantly went and found one and thought, right, well, now we can put that one to bed. And I know, because I've been one of those women, I was a one and done. And, it was really hard to get your voice heard, as was referred to earlier, tendency to be marginalized unless you really fought your corner and made your voice be heard. And interestingly, I've just experienced on one team I'm on, what is often talked about, which is on that team, we've just gone from 2 women on it to 3 women on it. And the change in the sense of balance and the extent to which the different voices are being listened to and referred back to, and the different points getting more weight, is really noticeable. So I do think that, that number of, that breaking down of the dominant group is a really important part of this. I do think, though, that the important thing here is that, on boards, there are the power roles, if you like. So there's the chair role, there's the senior independent director, and there are the committee chairs. And then on the ExCo, there's the CEO, the CFO, normally the operational leads. And it's those roles where you tend to find still the sort of traditional power group holding most of the roles. And I think that really matters, partly because doing those power roles is an important route to the diverse candidates getting to be chair or CEO in the future. And most career trajectories will have gone through, on boards, committee chair, SID, and then maybe you get to be the chair. And similarly, CEOs are normally coming from those traditional routes. Not that at all we shouldn't be much broader in our thinking about what sort of candidates could fill those roles. And the other thing is because the reality is that those power roles at both the ExCo and the board have more impact on the decisions being made. And so I think that's exactly where you need to have more diversity. And so, if I think about what investors should be doing, I would, particularly looking at a board, if they've got 33% or whatever females and other diversity, but actually the chair, SID, and all the committee chairs are white men, that might be a good place to start questioning how serious they are really about diversity.
Ruth, thank you so much. Those are really interesting points, and really interesting when you bring in kind of the power that specific roles play at an organisation. Mark, can I bring you in to comment on that? I'm sorry, Raj, I saw you put your hand up as well.
I liked what Ruth said there. I think for me, there's 2 big questions. The first question is, in this idea of breaking down the dominant group, what is best for the stewardship of the company, and who decides that? Where do investors and stakeholders get involved in that? And secondly, why is there this assumption that a diverse board is more difficult to manage, or that diverse candidates are more difficult to attract. This assumption is the manifestation of our own way of looking at the world. So I think when you're balancing those two ideas, you really have to find the right language to challenge those organizations, because that gets to the heart of their groupthink as a board.
Thank you, Aj. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Mark, would you like to comment on this as well?
Very, very happy to. Yes, absolutely. In our report, we have talked about diversity in a broader sense, to try to understand the patterns that we're seeing in terms of financial performance, and and to highlight the opportunity to improve board decision making by bringing broader styles of thinking and a wider range of life and career experiences into the boardroom. But Ruth is absolutely right to say, you know, visible diversity really matters. Those role model roles are really important, and we're certainly not advocating abandoning targets. Targets are a vital measure of progress, but the targets are not the goal in themselves, and I think that's the problem. And I do fear that we've seen the danger of measuring only one aspect of what makes up an individual. You know, diversity targets are very one-dimensional. Individuals are endlessly different, and many features of measures of representation are only a really very crude proxy of the differences of thinking in life and life experience. I think boards also, you know, many boards also sort of absolutely get it at one level. They support the case for diversity, but lower down in their organizations, you know, they really want that. They're delighted if their frontline staff are more representative of the communities that they serve. The difficulties come when you start talking about giving up power. That's where the really hard discussions start, and that it suddenly becomes rather more awkward. And I think going back to those sort of you know, relying on what I think in many cases are crude proxies for inclusion, well, for diversity, let alone inclusion, is that all of this allows the system to be gamed. You know, you can get credit for appointing an individual from your own network who shares a very similar career and life experiences to you, but just happens to be a different gender or color. You can even get away with tokenistic board appointments, parking somebody in the room, allowing them to sit around the board table, but not allowing them a meaningful voice. And neither of those approaches is going to help. It is going to address the ethical or business case for diversity or help reduce groupthink. So I think that, you know, there is a really big challenge for us of how do we spot the fakers here. You know, that sort of attributed quote to Groucho Marx that you know, if you can fake authenticity, you've got it made. Many have got away with that so far, and I think there's some very serious triangulation is needed here. The information is there, but it's quite hard to get to. I think, you know, talent will be one of the drivers here, because I think talent is pretty good at sussing out what it really feels like to work somewhere and what the real opportunities are, and diverse talent will migrate to organizations that are doing this authentically and well. And then finally, I think just, you know, of course there's a massive role and a massive burden on the chair. This is not going to happen unless the top team takes it on, and the top team's not going to take it on unless the chair is authentically behind it. But there's a really, really important role for the SID, I think, to encourage and support letting go.
Thank you, Mark. Those are great points. Would anyone else like to comment on this question? Okay, Aaron, over to you. Oh, you're on mute.
The most famous phrase from the pandemic. So thanks, Michael. And just moving on from there, I mean, we've obviously seen that the recruitment process is pretty key to obviously trying to actively promote diversity and inclusion. And just the FT published a letter earlier this year where a global recruitment consultant suggested that boards had to contend with reconciling two opposing requirements. On one hand, it was to improve diversity on the board, and the second was to appoint qualified directors on the other. Responses to this letter called out this implicit bias in framing diversity, and obviously the tension that's related to diversity strategies off the back of that. Just in terms of how, you know, the recruitment industry can try and support this agenda, it'd be great to hear about the kinds of initiatives or actions that could be taken from an industry perspective, and how the recruitment industry is really trying to approach this idea that, you know, supplying quality candidates and having a diverse board aren't mutually exclusive. Perhaps we can just you know, start off with Raj, given your focus. Thanks, Raj.
Yeah, so I'll come at it from two perspectives. Last year we started, or we were one of the partners that started Race Equality Matters, and we got 2,000 firms signed up in 9 months and gave them free stuff to do. And some of that was around recruitment review, etc. So I think the idea of free resource is important. But from that, we also got a really good view into those organisations. And secondly, of course, is Green Park is a £70 million a year headhunter and diversity consultancy. So we're small, certainly by the standards of some of these global firms. But you can't tell me that there isn't diversity in a pool of 50 million people. You know, if you're Heidrick and Struggles or Spencer Stewart or Russell Reynolds or Korn Ferry or Egon Zehnder, you know, the 5 big firms, you know, they've got these jobs are all global in outlook. So what you're really saying is, I can't attract people to you. So then it's for the client to decide whether it's me, whether it's the client's brand, or whether it's the fact that the people that the client now wants to talk to being told no for the last 20 years from these global headhunters. It's as with everything, there's grey here. I think it's insulting to suggest that more diversity means a weaker shortlist. I just think it's insulting, and I think people see through that now. What people don't see is that search firms and the recruitment industry in general is based on a time and materials basis. So if I go to a piece of work that I've done for BP, I don't work with BP, by the way, but if a headhunter goes to a piece of work at BP, then a lot of that can be recycled. So you get into a situation that although the client's cost is variable, the time and materials drives a certain economic model and behavior. So all these people talking about recruitment, they don't understand how recruitment works, fine. The second thing is that what most clients need nowadays is an authentic and intelligent bridge into markets that they can't find themselves on LinkedIn. It's about that insight and relationship capital to deal with the preconceptions about that brand. And nowhere is that more prevalent than in non-executive roles. So I think the basic premise here is, you know, don't drink the Kool-Aid. It's nonsense. In fact, it's insulting nonsense. So when you hear a firm talk to you about diversity and you look at their website and they haven't got anybody, you know, they've got 3 women who all went to, you know, Woldingham Fine School, you know, and Balliol Oxford or whatever it is, right? That's not authentic. So one has to be able to give the customer what they don't have. And sometimes that's uncomfortable truths. Often it's data about, you know, why is gender in your technology department 25% lower than in your competitors for talent? Here's what people say. So I think this idea of recruitment fixing itself is naive, because the vast majority of recruitment firms don't have any lived experience. Their idea of diversity is to cut and paste what their American cousins do or their American owners do. And I can tell you firsthand, the American context is very different from our own, massively. And the idea of cutting and pasting itself is dangerous, just as this conversation where you had a little conversation there about tokenism. The real problem for tokenism for me isn't that you put a person on the board and they don't do anything. It's that the good people look at that appointment and go, my goodness, is that right? And the people in the organization turn around and go, is that the best we could get? So I think recruitment is a massive part of this problem, particularly the search industry, because what they do is they do what they always do and then look for somebody different to punt at the end. I know that firsthand from people that we work with, et cetera, it's very frustrating for individuals. But until the clients are intelligent to ask for something different and actually partner, as opposed to say, here's 3 invoices, go and get me some miracles, they don't want to hear why people aren't interested in them. So the whole relationship, that there isn't an adult to adult relationship between most large organizations and search firms. So there will be some organizations who grasp that nettle and get a disproportionate percentage of the talent. And then it comes down to retention and then being there in 18 months and feeling that the opportunity and mandate allows their lived experience and diversity to add additional value, as opposed to doing the same job and just looking differently. So you've got some complexity there, but in terms of the quote, I mean, what a load of nonsense. Imagine if someone said that 10 years ago, well, we couldn't have a woman on the board because they don't have the right qualifications. It's just rubbish. So for me, that's lazy thinking and dangerous thinking from a global firm that's so influential.
No, absolutely, and part and parcel of the process is getting high quality candidates actually through the pipeline, and a lot of the focus on inclusion and diversity is actually sort of moved towards the younger generation, younger people, and just making sure we've got good people coming through from different backgrounds, very diverse backgrounds, into those kinds of roles and situations that allow them to evolve over decades into very highly qualified board members. Can just ask the thoughts.
Sorry, Aaron, it's fanciful to think if I recruit a load of ethnic minority or visibly disabled graduates, I'm going to end up with that in the board. No, our research has shown that in terms of black talent, we're a net exporter of black talent from the FTSE 100 all around the world, and that's male and female. So, we can't have this lazy thinking that says, we feed the sausage factory and we get something at the other end in 20 years. It's nonsense. What we need to do is make those organizations more attractive and then go and headhunt people, as opposed to running this kind of search and selection machine that says, we've talked to the best 50 and here are the best 5. And in actual fact, what you need to do is disproportionately target the talent that you're short of to address your board diversity without ever lowering the bar.
Yeah, valuable points. Would others like to share thoughts? Possibly Deborah and or others? Ruth, please go ahead, you put your hand up. And then maybe, I think a few people will, so we're going to pitch into this question. Thanks, Raj.
I'll be super quick. So I have fought on many occasions to remove language from, it might be in the governance report, might be in the nominations committee report, but language like, our board fully values the importance, the board recognizes the great value of diversity. However, we are a meritocracy and all appointments must be made on merit, or the best person must be selected. I mean, if you want another very easy way of identifying boards that seriously don't get this, it's when they say something like that, for all the reasons that Raj has said.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. I think a few others.
I mean, I think, this perception that, you have to give something up and that there's a cost to be diverse. There's a brilliant quote in the report from Professor Scott Page, who I think he's so brilliant on all of this, but he says, there's often this perception we can be excellent or we can be diverse. And actually excellence requires diversity. But I'm afraid to say that, we heard these excuses and these explanations, when we began engaging on diversity in 2011, but I think they also still exist now. I think it's a hugely deeply held kind of view that there's some kind of costly consequence here. And I think you also have to challenge this idea that every single board appointment and every management appointment since the world began has been made through the best of processes that are unbiased and that have, sought out the best pool of talent. And we know that not to be true, because look at, who our leaders are and the bias there. It's just no longer credible. And I think we're having a much better conversation. And I think more and more investors are willing to challenge flawed nominations processes that are leading to these outcomes that seem to be explained by, oh, well, we have to appoint on merit, or we wanted to be diverse, but, we have to appoint on talent. Surely if you widen the pool of talent from which you choose, you will get the best candidates. But it goes back to the point we make in the report about these are deeply difficult conversations now, because it's about people giving power up, and it's about status quo that's deeply entrenched in society. So I think this is why we wanted to kind of give guidance, but we have to begin to call this out within boardrooms. But also I think investors are increasingly skeptical about the same names and the same types of individuals being appointed to these roles, when, as Ruth says, there's great narrative in the annual report that tells us how much diversity is valued. But back to Raj's point as well about strategy, it's a major gap. One of the requirements of the UK Corporate Governance Code is linking diversity to a strategic vision, and it means looking at where you are now and where you need to get to. And I think if this effort stays within diversity and inclusion teams, with no disrespect to them, the board will continue to go on its merry way and make these types of appointments. So it's all very, very interlinked, but the pressure is just mounting from all types of stakeholders.
Thanks very much. Mark, please. Mark, Christine, please feel free.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the problems, is how the process is run from the company end. It would be easy to pile into the headhunters and say they just do a cut and paste job. But if you've already if you want a long list next week, and all along you've already made your mind up as to who you're going to hire, it's not going to be a good process. So I think I think the big problem is, I agree that there are limitations in the headhunter model, service model, but it's how we use them that is really important. I do think there's an issue about a danger of forgetting what the role of the non-executive director is in all of this. There are so many role profiles where they seem to have been designed in a way where they're either expected to, manage or double team the executive team. You want identical industry experience, and forgetting that the role is, one of the key parts of the role is to bring wider experience and fresh perspective to what ought to be a high quality management team. So I don't get that, and I think in financial services, we definitely have a problem with the regulatory approval process, and the fact that the most onerous part of the process for some people is being interviewed by the regulator for the job. It just drives, I know it's unintended consequences, but it's a major impediment to people from outside the sector, and for people who are new and first time to a board getting through, and that's just a bad thing. I think there's actually quite a bit, I'm hoping that there's quite a bit we're going to learn from the employee representative process, where we've got people fresh to a board, but with definitely something to add and offer. How that works out, I think there'll be some learning and some encouragement from that, I hope.
Thanks for sharing that. Christine, I know you wanted to share some thoughts also.
Yeah. Just a story, actually. One of my earlier experiences of being brought on an interview panel was because the candidates said that, how come there's no woman in the interview panel? So that, oh, great, Christine is ethnic and she's woman, take 2 boxes, buy one, get one free. Why don't we just get her on board? So I was on board, and the interview was looking for a leader. And I remember amongst the candidates, the point I want to make here is that in diversity, there are also leadership style differences. And a lot of the times when we try to choose candidates, whether it's on a board or on executives, we tend to give more marks. I mean, Raj would probably know about this phenomenon, is that we tend to give more marks to people who speak louder or who speak more. But the fact that someone who's speaking less doesn't mean that they are less confident. It could be just the way they operate. So on that particular in that particular interview, I actually turned the conclusion around. I'm very, very proud of that situation, because initially the whole panel was saying, oh, this person was it's got a gravitas. You know, they can talk and then stand and make big statements. It's really, really good. And I started off with pointing out that actually those big statements were made without much substance. We did a case study, we discussed the situation. And then there was the candidate that turned out to be pointing out a lot of the issues and showing that they were detail oriented, that eventually got shortlisted or got the offer. So I think when it comes to diversity and thinking of different, addressing the groupthink at the interview panel is also very important. It is possible by being very analytical and careful about pointing what the job requires the candidate to do to be able to add diversity in leadership style as well. And I'm very pleased with that story. So thanks for allowing me to share that.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And your own personal experiences are very, they help share some important messages. And I guess, you know, moving into, I'll let Michael move into the next session, but the next question. But as investors, as investment professionals, I'm just wondering how we factor into this. With that, I'll Michael.
Yeah, that's so great. Thanks, Aaron. And some great points made on that last question. So the question, as called out, so focuses on the investor's perspective and influence on board diversity. So although the investor community is exerting timely and significant pressure on companies to improve diversity, that pressure is generally uncoordinated and faces specific challenges. So one of these, highlighted in the first question in this panel discussion, relates to the lack of agreement on what specific metrics can define a diverse board. In addition, investors also face the challenge of companies greenwashing and frequently self-selecting data that make their contributions to diversity appear more progressive. For example, highlighting their well-balanced board through a gender lens, but not disclosing that there is no ethnic or racial diversity on the board. So a question for the panel: how can the investor community help influence the journey for more diverse boards? And ought the industry be more targeted in collectively applying pressure on firms that do not make meaningful progress to diversify their boards? And I know a few of you want to answer this question. So I've got Mark, Christine, and Deborah. Perhaps we start in that order.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, yeah, absolutely. You know, investor pressure is definitely having an impact here, and that's great. But I think the fact that it is a bit fragmented and not well coordinated, you know, the danger is that it becomes a measurement exercise to track and manage compliance rather than you know, an absolutely key cultural measure that it should be. And you know, whilst representation is something that is you know, relatively easy to measure, at least for some of the more obvious dimensions of diversity, inclusion is really hard to measure. You know, it's one of those sort of tricky cultural things. You know it when you're in it, but you know, we're all going to have to work hard on better measures for that. I think one of the reasons that gives us some opportunity is I don't see any. I don't see the diversity of the board and diversity and inclusion in the workplace as separate challenges. You know, it's the board's responsibility to do this. It's the board's responsibility to have D&I as a strategic imperative and to reflect it in its business model and everything it does. So I think if you know, encouraging companies to tell their story in the broadest sense on this and to assess the scale of ambition, commitment to the journey and pace of change for the organization as a whole gives you pretty good insight to where the leadership is. You know, and it's going to be difficult. We're going to need to look at a wider range of qualitative measures. We're going to have to place more value on narrative reporting. Hooray! That would be great. And we're going to have to encourage rather than kind of stifle differentiation. And we can't have that sort of rush to formulaic reporting on this. I don't know how we stop that, but we're going to have to try and stop that. I think risk has its part to play in this. You know, if you don't feel welcome and comfortable being your true self at work, you're not going to speak up when things don't feel right. So organizations that are not doing this well ought to have a higher risk profile. we do need targets. I don't, I've already expressed my reservations about how great those targets are. It'd be wonderful if we had some sort of consistent organizing framework for D&I in the same way that TCFD has helped us enormously in relation to climate disclosure. It'd be wonderful if there was some equivalent would emerge, but I'm open to suggestion as to how we might get there. And finally, I think I would just say, point about the industry itself. It's really, you've got to look at your own house first, and it's pretty hard to challenge with credibility if you're not an exemplar yourself. Thank you.
Those are great points. Thank you, Mark. Christine, can I bring you in to comment?
Sure, and I love to speak from experience. Investor engagement is where we can get insights. And when I say engagement, it's not just one board. There are different ways of doing engagement. Investor can ask for different setup when they engage with board members. It could be a combination of executives and non-executives. It could be just more executives and fewer non-executives, and it could be more independent director and then executives. And those combinations do matter. So, so a story again, two stories actually. The first one is, I remember there was, I was meeting with a board chair and the CEO of a financial institution. It turned out that there was a bit of a mis-selling scandal, allegations around that. And I posed a question to the CEO. She explained the kind of measures they put in place, also compliance, improvements, systems, tracking. And then in a very casual way, she said that, oh, well, this is what I've done, how I see it, but my chairman may have a different view. And in a very comfortable way, she turned to him and said, do you want to say a few words? And for me, how comfortable she is in bringing out these issues, and the chairman just come in, he actually said something completely different to what she said. I thought that's at least give me a glimpse of what could be quite a healthy balance. I mean, it was right in front of investors. It was the first time we met as well. And also contrast to another investor engagement meeting that I was in. The board has just introduced the first female director, and that was the first time she met with everyone. And I posted a question to her directly, and I could see that she was still looking around, especially looking at the chair and the executives to see if she was saying the right thing. So all this investor engagement is going to help understand, okay, is this a firmly established director, or how comfortable he or she is? And the best thing of it is that if you can keep to that sort of setup over time. I remember 2 years later, I went back to the same board round table, and that director has completely changed. She was confident in the way she explained what was going on, and she was giving her viewpoint. She wasn't checking with anybody else anymore. So I actually felt that, at least the way I interpreted, was that she's more established in the board. She knows her role, she knows what she can contribute to, and she's comfortable with it. So that would be what I'd say. And engage in different settings so that you get the feeling of how they.
Christine, thank you. And I really like that example that you've just shared. Deborah, did you want to comment on this one, or did you want to move us, or do you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'm happy to move on to the next question, conscious of time. Thank you.
Sounds good. Aaron, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. So I guess, I mean, the conversation is, we talk about it within a broader context. We talk about the inequalities and obviously racism as systemic risks with companies, leading by example on diversity and inclusion to try and drive better societal outcomes. I'm just going to share some figures again from the recruitment firm Heidrick & Struggles, who released their US Board Monitor 2021 last week. And again, some of the headlines were, within Fortune 500 firms, the number of new Black directors was almost triple that of previous years, with 3/4 of the appointments made after May the 25th, which is obviously the murder of George Floyd. As many major corporations announced renewed commitments to diversity and racial equality. They also cited that there was an increase in women appointees. Sorry, there was a decrease. They also cited there was a decrease in women appointees, and Latinx and Asian American appointments were mostly flat when compared with previous years. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, has also shared a diverse mix of voices leads to better decisions and outcomes for everyone. The question to the panel, and perhaps Ruth, you'd like to share your thoughts. Just given the key role that corporate leadership plays in driving the economy and impacting societal outcomes, what could and should we expect from boards as change makers when looking to society's inclusion and diversity challenges across gender, ethnicity, LGBTQ+, disability and social mobility, among others?
Okay, well, it's a huge question, Aaron, so let me just pick at a bit of it. So first of all, I'd like to comment that George Floyd's death, from what I've seen in a lot of different organizations, George Floyd's death has had an enormous impact. And I have seen many very senior leaders really enormously heightened in terms of their awareness and their outreach and wanting to listen and really understand what the lived experience of ethnically diverse people in their organizations is, and people who have been really quite shocked and profoundly impacted by what they've heard. So I think that that is certainly not something which is sort of stayed static. There's been a big shift there. And I also think this whole recognition of the role of business and companies in society has been accelerated really greatly. So I almost think of it as Section 172 sort of coming out of its chrysalis over the last couple of years. And having progressed from, oh my goodness, we've got to write something in the annual report to say how we've addressed Section 172 to, more and more companies really believing that having a purpose and being driven to deliver societal value and societal goals, that is much more profound and prevalent and becoming more and more the core of strategy. And I saw that, by the way, you mentioned in introducing me the COVID Recovery Commission that I was on, where I was involved with about 8 other businesses. And all of those businesses absolutely saw the critical role of businesses in delivering economic recovery to COVID, not just in what is done and driving towards the all sort of economic structure and strength, but also how it's done in driving improvements in inequality, in lack of diversity and inclusion, lack of opportunity, and so on and so on. So I think it's very real and alive. What I think it needs to mean is, first of all, I think that senior leaders should be prepared to be open and vocal about the importance of these issues, take platforms, talk about it. But it's absolutely critical that it's not about talking primarily, it's about doing. I think doing has to be probably first of all about the culture right through an organization. So what are really the norms and behaviors right through the organization? Are there open conversations? And is there real non-tolerance of discrimination, the kind of behaviors that would be unacceptable? And the board and the executive committee really need to think about how they're engaging and how they know that. So I think that's a very important piece. The talent process, I think, is incredibly important. Is the talent process there to bring in all kinds of talent, to make sure that all kinds of talent can progress and are encouraged and supported and get all the opportunities they need? And then I think that, coming back to this COVID Recovery Commission, a really important role in society, so in the communities that business work in, to be a sort of, working with civic leaders about outreach, about community infrastructure, community resilience, providing role modeling, different programs and so on. So a whole range of things that to me would be the sign of a business and a leadership that is really trying to drive this.
Conscious of time, we are slightly over. I'll close it out firstly by thanking Deborah and Mark for presenting your important work, and to this fantastic panel, Ruth, Christine, Raj, for such an engaging discussion on this important topic. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone who's dialed into this webinar for your interest, engagement, and for helping to contribute to greater diversity within financial services and beyond.